Gold Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee, who is our resident expert, a placer miner, former school teacher, historian, collector, and today we're going to be taking a look at a town in the very south-central part of British Columbia, very close to the American border. It's called Rossland. What's special about Rossland, Bill?
Rossland was the most famous gold town in British Columbia in the 1890s, and probably right up through the middle part of the teens. And it was so famous it became known as the Golden City.
How did it compare as amount of gold, say, as compared to Barkerville, which predated it?
Took out more gold than Barkerville, probably. Depends upon which figures you use, but certainly one of the mines in Rossland produced over 20 million at the time. That was the famous Leroy. And this would be equivalent to, Mike, if we took the gold price today, over $600 million out of one mine. So the mines in Rossland at today's gold price produced well over $1 billion.
$1 billion. A lot of money. Now, we've heard about some very strange characters who've discovered mines, circus performers who've discovered ore bodies. Who is responsible for discovering the ore in Rossland?
Again, two French Canadians. One who took all the credit, and the one who really deserved the credit didn't get it. Now, in 1890, a number of miners were streaming over the old Dewdney Trail. And two of these miners, a guy called Oliver Bordeaux and a guy called Joe Morris, were working on a claim down there called the Lily May, and this was in the South Belt region, south of Rossland, and south of a peculiar volcanic cone called Red Mountain. Now they could see Red Mountain across the valley, but they kept on working on the Lily May until another man arrived on the scene, and his name was Joe Bourgeois, and so Bourgeois teamed up with Morris. By this time, Oliver Bordeaux went another area, and they began working towards this volcanic cone. And as they went across the valley, Morris staked a mine called the Home Stake, and then in the early part of July 1890, they went up a draw which was later called War Eagle Draw, and as they came up this draw, they began picking up pieces of float. And
float, what's that?
Well, float is ore that has come off the main vein somewhere, and the float was very rich looking, at least to their eyes, and they were fairly experienced. And they staked 4 claims. They staked the Virginia, the Idaho, the War Eagle, the Center Star, and then, although they were not allowed to, they staked another extension, which they called the Lawise. And then on the 4th of July, which was the big holiday in the Kootenai country, because most of these miners were Americans, they decided to go to Nelson to replenish their supplies and assay these samples they'd taken. So they took the samples into an assayer in Nelson and found that the richest sample only assayed $3.25, and some of them didn't show any metallic content at all. No gold, no silver. They didn't know, but they'd gone to an assayer who wasn't experienced. And at that precise junction, an individual walked down Baker Street in Nelson, a very fascinating man. His name was Eugene Sayre Topping. He'd been an Indian fighter and a poet and a newspaper man, and he had been a jack of all trades. He was an entrepreneur. At that time, he was deputy mining recorder. And so they said, Topping, are you interested in these samples? So they showed him the samples, and Topping had a very good eye. He looked at the samples, decided he'd take a chance. They said, look, if you'll pay $12.50 for recording these claims, we'll give you your choice of the 5 claims. So Topping, smart boy, took the samples to the best assayer in Nelson, and he came back with assays of 2 and 3 ounces per ton in gold alone, which was spectacular. Well, he neglected to tell, of course, Morris and Bourgeois of his results, and a couple of weeks later he went back with them to Rossland, and they walked along what is now known as Red Mountain, and he walked over all this ground. And as he walked over the Virginia, he liked it, but not that much, and the Idaho was fairly good, and the War Eagle was better, and the Center Star was better yet. But as he got out the edge of Red Mountain, he was on the Lawise. And he said, this is what you call a Lawise? He said, I'll take it, but I'll call it the Leroy, the king. And so in French, he called it the Leroy, and he bought it for $12.50, and that was the beginning of the Rossland Rush, because the strikes on Red Mountain were absolutely spectacular. And what happened, of course, is that he sold his share in the Leroy, all of it, for about $30,000. The Leroy produced millions and millions and millions of dollars for a bunch of sharp operators from the Inland Empire around Spokane.
Okay, we're going to talk about Rossland today. When we come back, we'll see some of those wonderful historic photographs that tell us so much about that time when Rossland was the Golden City. Be back right after this break. Welcome back. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee talking about Rossland. So Morris gets all the credit, but really it's Bourgeois who did the finding of these big ore bodies.
Yeah, there's not much doubt about that. Bourgeois was a mine finder. Morris was not. Bourgeois proved that by later on discovering the very rich gold placers on the Bull River, and then soon after that he discovered the famous North Star mine, which was at one time the premier silver mine of British Columbia. And then he kind of disappears. He walks off the historical stage.
And then this guy Topping gets all this money and then gives it away. This is what we're talking about Rossland looking like early on.
Yeah, this is Sourdough Alley, and this is when Rossland they've just made a strike at the War Eagle and the Center Star, and Patsy Clark has hit spectacular ore that ran from 2 ounces to over 20 ounces a ton. And so they threw together a town, and this was the kind of a crooked thoroughfare that went through the town. This is the first main street of Rossland, 1895.
Sourdough Alley. And they already had delusions of grandeur, palace, livery.
Oh, sure.
Remarkable. A little bit later on.
Actually, about the same time, Mike. This is 94 and 95, and this is Columbia Avenue. This is the rival main street of Rossland, and this eventually became the main street. And this is the beginning of Columbia Avenue, the false front buildings going up.
Now, you've already mentioned a number of names, all which are fascinating, the Topping and the Bourgeois and the Morrises, but there's another name in here. You call him the boy millionaire?
The boy millionaire. You're talking about now a guy called Fritz Augustus Heinz, and he made his millions. Actually, he was a multi-millionaire by the time he was about 24. And he came from Butte, Montana, heard about the strikes in Rossland, decided to get in there on the ground floor, but he was a little bit late. He was a little bit late because these Sharpies from the Inland Empire around Spokane, guys like General Warren and Patsy Clark and the bartender Billy Harris, they beat him to it. So he said he came into Rossland. He couldn't purchase any of the major mines, so he went down about 6 or 7 miles away and started a smelter and trail. And eventually sold that smelter to the CPR, went back to Butte, Montana, made millions more, and eventually lost his entire fortune, $50 million. At that time, that would be about $1 billion on Wall Street.
Fritz Augustus Heinz.
Yeah, fascinating character.
All right. Of course, we're talking about people who made the millions in the mines, but there were hundreds, thousands of people who just worked for wages. Who are these guys?
Sure, these are the guys. This is probably the Center Star, and it shows one of the ore cars. And they're pushing the ore cars into the Center Star and drilling right into, putting tunnels right into Red Mountain. And they had hundreds of miles of tunnels in Red Mountain.
Now, we've talked in other shows about the Sticking Johnny, and that's what we've got right here. This is, we finally meet the ever-popular Sticking Johnny. And what precisely is it?
Well, the Sticking Johnny, they'd have a little candle right here, and they would stick this into one of the timbers, and this would let them. They'd be at the face of the ore, and they could see when they were trying to drill out the ore.
So really, their only light being down in the mines was from this candle?
At that time, yes. Later on, they'd use carbide lamps.
So we have a carbide lamp here, which is, when did it come in as compared to the candle?
Well, the hard hats and the carbide lamps came in much later. This would be 1920s when Rossland was approaching the end.
And we talked with about carbide lamps before. There's a fluid that goes in the top here. What's that, just water?
Yeah, just water.
And carbide, what is carbide that goes down in the bottom?
Carbide acts with the water itself. The water drips on the carbide and produces a spark, and then you have a flame varying from a few inches to a couple of feet if you want.
So a guy would light his lamp by just having the flint in there and flick that, and that would set the gas off. And
yeah.
I guess this would show a heck of a lot better than that little candle would.
Oh, yeah, much better.
Boy, being down in the darks of the mines with only a candle, you had to be a nerves of steel kind of person.
Some of the miners grew to like it.
They grew to like it.
Yeah.
Well, they were a strange brood, I guess.
Yes.
Where are we looking here? What part of the country are we looking at right now?
This is the War Eagle and probably the nickel plate beyond that, and two of the mines on Red Mountain. And, you know, it shows some of the activity. Those are large mines. It's pretty impressive.
What's the walkway or the some sort of conduit that goes up to that stack in the center of the picture?
Yeah, well, they worked winter and summer, so that was a covered walkway, so they wouldn't be slipping on the ice, so they actually covered the walkway to get to the shaft house on top.
All right. And that's one of the mines?
Yeah. And this shows the Center Star and the War Eagle, another shot, and two of the other mines, and two great producers in Rossland.
Now, with the War Eagle and the Center Star, they're two separate mines, two separate shafts, two separate claims?
That's correct.
They're close together. I mean, they're side by each up here.
Yes, they are, and they became so famous that eventually these Rossland mines led to the commencement of the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, so each one of these mines, there was no sort of centralization. These were still owned by separate people and still produced that way.
Yes, they were. They were separate entities.
And this shows sort of the three of the major producers.
Yeah, it shows the major producer on the right-hand side, and that is the famous Leroy.
Which was, what was it called originally when this guy taught
It was called the Leroy's originally, but it produced about 40 tons of gold alone, as well as silver and copper. And then it also shows the War Eagle, and over on the left-hand side, it shows the Josie, which was also a very good producer. We used to play on these mines when I was a kid all the time.
Because you grew up in Rossland.
Yeah, I spent many of my formative years there.
Fire is so much a part of every town we've talked about, it seems to me. Did the whole town of Rossland go with this one?
Not in this one. This is 1902. In fact, the infamous International House or hotel on the right-hand side was not affected. This is looking up Spokane Avenue, and it was a fairly serious fire, but not as serious as the fire of 1929.
Tell me about there's probably a story in the International House. There's always one of these places.
Yes, unfortunately, most of the stories can't be told. They were high-stakes gambling games. It was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and there were rather some infamous characters frequented the famous International House.
And there had to be a man bigger than the Times itself to control this activity.
Yeah, this is Big John Kirkup, or Big Jack Kirkup. He was the mountain sheriff in Rossland for about a year and a half, and he was probably the most famous lawman in British Columbia in his day. Was about 6 feet 5 inches tall, weighed about 315 pounds, and kept the law with a shot-loaded cane, and also carried a Colt as kind of backup.
Now, that's a bit of a rarity, isn't it? In Canadian history, a Colt sidearm is not what you'd regularly find.
Well, it's debatable, Mike. In early years, perhaps that's true. But certainly, this, by the way, is Kirkup's original Colt, and 1875, and he carried that in case he needed backup, but usually he didn't.
His lead-shot cane would serve the purpose perfectly well.
Oh, sure. He walked into Spellman's Saloon in the early years when he was there in Rossland, and they were shooting at each other. The gamblers, a high-stakes poker game came apart at the seams, and he just waded in with a shot-loaded cane, and about 5 minutes later, he was the only guy left in the saloon.
Some of the characters you're talking about, some of the ladies of the evening, Scrap Iron who?
So, yeah, well, there's Popcorn Kate and Scrap Iron Nellie and a number of individuals who frequented the red light district in Rossland. Remember, Rossland was a hard rock mining town. There were thousands of men working on the hill. Columbia Avenue was busy day and night. It had over 40 hotels. It had 2 railroads coming into the town. It had an opera house. It had the Rossland Club, where all the major deals were struck. The famous Allen Hotel. So it was the 4th largest city in British Columbia, and people thought it would last forever. They thought the mines in Red Mountain would go down probably 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and some of them went down over 1,000 feet.
Remarkable story. This is all perking along around 1900 in south central British Columbia.
Right.
Yeah, perking along, to say the least. There's I guess an early shot showing just sort of the commerce on the street, right?
Yeah, that's close to the turn of the century. And this is actually a parade. It's probably either 4th of July or 24th of May, and I would think 4th of July, this particular one. And it shows some of the floats, put out by the various businesses in Rossland, and a bit of a crowd gathering on the street.
So a little hard to date some of these photographs, but what you've identified is that there aren't very many power poles in that shot, but here you even see the West Kootenay Power and Light sign.
That's right. You can see that on the left-hand side, and the West Kootenay Power and Light started in 1896. So this is probably just after the turn of the century. And it shows Rossland, a winter scene in Rossland, and winter lasts there about 6 months. And on the right-hand side is Mount Roberts, and over to the right of that, beyond the picture, would be Red Mountain.
And the snow is what we come to know Rossland for today. I mean, Nancy Green, Red Mountain, and all
Sure.
that, that's a long way down the line. As you already pointed out, you were raised in this country and picked up hundreds and hundreds of coins and tokens
Sure.
throughout that area.
Yeah.
And where did you find most of these?
Most of these were found on the boardwalk in Rossland, and we found them between what we call the bus depot and Hunter Brothers' big store. And we would go there as kids and just look through the sand and gravel underneath and didn't think of screening it at all, Mike.
Yeah.
And as soon as we got some coins, which are usually Victorian coins, occasionally a gold coin, we would run off to the theater and spend our easily gotten gains.
Some of them are wonderfully struck. This one with a very fancy outside DS pounded in the middle. Would that indicate the guy who owned it?
That's right, and that's one of the only maverick on all these tokens here. In other words, we're not sure of the owner there, but it was found under the boardwalk in Rossland, so we assume it was a Rossland token.
So there are little treasures, and these are some of them. And some, I guess they're now encased in the concrete of the existing town.
Oh, certainly. I mean, that's all. The original boardwalk, which was standing when I was a kid, is now gone. It's asphalt.
They had lots of things to occupy their time, obviously working 12 hours a day in the mine, but occasionally they got a day off. What are they doing here?
Actually, the early mining law was changed to 8 hours a day thanks to Rossland miners and the Rossland Western Federation of Miners. So that these guys worked 8 hours a day, but they worked usually 7 days a week. But occasionally when a holiday came along, they'd have a drilling contest. This is a single jacking drilling contest, and a guy was given 15 minutes to drill as deep as he could into a solid piece of granite. And if he was successful and beat everyone else, there would be a considerable prize of several $100s and thousands of dollars changing hands between the onlookers who would bet on the various teams.
We should have a single jacking demonstration here, because I don't think anybody knows what it is to drive a piece of square steel into a rock.
Well, actually, the steel is eight-sided, and what they did, it was a double jacking contest. One man would hold the steel for a couple of minutes, and the other one would turn it about an eighth of a turn each time, and he would be hit with a sledgehammer and drive it down. Then they'd have change steel, and they'd quickly change in literally a second or two. And the other man would take over because, of course, pounding the steel and it was the most difficult work.
And how far could they get into a piece of granite?
Probably over 40 inches, a very good team, and that's in 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah.
And the reason for that, obviously, is to what? Put a charge in and blow it up and get
sure.
the ore down.
This is to see how fast they were in the mine.
Gosh, and they had to do that all day. That was their job.
Yeah, they wouldn't work at that pace all day.
What are these guys doing?
This is a hose reel race in Rossland in 1913, and they would run down the street for about 100 yards and see how long it would take them to run 100 yards, and they would get a prize for it. You can see the opposing team, one of the opposing teams off on the left-hand side, watching their rivals run down the street.
Casting aspersions on their attempt, undoubtedly.
Yeah, and this is the way they went to the fires.
Dragging a hose reel, and did they have fire hydrants and stuff like that there, or did they have to carry pumper trucks? What did they?
Oh no, this was before the pumper trucks.
Yeah. And here's a parade. It seems that the historic photographers came out for parades.
Yes, indeed. This is looking up Spokane Street, which is just off Columbia Avenue, and this is probably 1914, late August of 1914, and this was the first contingent of Rossland men to go to the Great War, the World War I, and this is probably the 54th Kootenai Battalion. And it's unfortunate, but most of the men who went in the first contingent of the 54th Kootenai Battalion did not return. It was literally annihilated in the various battles of World War I.
You had a couple of uncles who were in that battalion, weren't you?
Yes, one of them was in the 54th Kootenai and the other was in an Okanagan regiment, and they're both 19 years old, and they died within 24 hours of each other. Big men, 6 feet 1 inch tall, but really they were just kids. They were 19 years old.
Not many came back, and so many volunteered and went.
Yes, that's true.
Remarkable story. The railway is a part of everything we've ever talked about, with the exception of, I guess, some of the early placer operations.
Mm-hmm.
How many railways came into Rossland? 2.
The Red Mountain Railway and later on the CPR. And Fritz Augustus Heinz put the first one in, and the CPR eventually extended that to standard gauge. And this is a shot of the CPR and the railway station at Rossland. And it's a rather interesting photograph because there are no dogs in sight. Of course, dogs just avoided the train stations because they were petrified about of the locomotive and the steam hissing out of it and so on. And in the background,
it was the largest cat they've ever run across, I guess. What's in the background? Sorry.
The background is a brass band, and this may be Professor Antoniolo's brass band from Rossland, which in its day was quite famous, Mike, because they thought that this was really a world-class band, and they decided to go on a world tour. And their first stop was Spokane. And Spokane thought, before they played, that they were a world-class band too. But they weren't a world-class band, because after the first night in Spokane, the headlines in the papers read the next day, "Go back to the mines. One night from the Rossland band is too much." So they slunk back into Rossland, of course.
The shortest world tour on record.
Oh, yeah.
Poor old Professor Antoniolo?
Yeah, I believe so.
Something like that. All right. Then we take a look at the town at its heyday. I guess it covered the entire mountain.
Yeah, it did. This is about 1910, and Rossland was really a boom town, and it remained a boom town right through 1910 until about 1929, until finally they got down too deep in the mines on Red Mountain, and the CM&S, which was the big company that now controlled the mines at that time, decided to close down the hill, and they closed the hill down, and that was essentially the end of Rossland as a mining town.
Population at its heyday?
About 8,000.
Fourth biggest town in British Columbia.
Fourth largest city in British Columbia.
And it produced a lot of money.
It produced, the figures vary, but probably equivalent to well over $1 billion in today's price of gold.
Okay. Take a break. Be back in a second with more of Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Look at Rossland. Don't go away. Welcome back. I'm Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee. Gold Trails and Ghost Town is looking at Rossland today. Treasure stories are always a thing I like to touch on. We can't tell maybe the best Rossland treasure story, but we can tell about a lost mine.
Yeah, there's several supposedly lost mines in the Rossland area. One was the famous Iron Door. And whether or not it exists, we don't know, Mike. But the possibility is still there because Rossland wasn't just Red Mountain. There was the South Belt region, there was the OK Mountain, there was the Velvet area. So there were a number of areas around Rossland that produced prodigious amounts of gold, especially in the OK Mountain region, where the so-called Iron Door mine is supposed to be located, somewhere in that area, because they had mines like the IXL and the Midnight and the Snowdrop. And some of those mines were so rich, they produced the second richest ton of gold ore in Canadian history. 1 ton yielded almost $500,000 in gold at today's prices. 1 ton, which is about this big.
That ore, what that was a huge amount of gold in each bucket load.
It was spectacular. That was the Linds and the Osings and all these old leaser miners who knew the Rossland area extremely well. And it was probably richer than that because they had it actually piled outside in one of the CM&S areas. And as each man came off shift, he helped himself to the best ore. So all they got was the second-rate ore, and that proved to be astonishingly rich.
Now these guys were I guess the originators of conspicuous consumption. Were they?
Oh yeah, they were doing so well that some of these guys were buying themselves a new car every few weeks. It was just that good.
They just buy one, wreck it, and buy another one.
That's right. It was in the midst of the Depression, too.
Why do you refer to it as the lost mine? I mean, how can you lose a mine, especially with all the tailings and stuff associated with it?
Well, you know, a number of lost mines have been found in that area and also lost, and we do have definite proof. We'll save most of that for another program, but there's some fascinating stories out of the Kootenays about lost mines or lost leads.
All right. Bill Barlee, thank you very much. The story we've been looking at is Rossland, the Golden City. Join us next time for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Bye-bye.